Hi, folks. Welcome to this second of our Access Innovations webinars, Meaning Matters. This is going to be a really interesting one presented by a friend of mine, Bob Allkin from Kew Gardens. We're going to wait for just a few minutes as people are still signing on, and then we'll get going. All right, we're 2 minutes in. Again, this is Bill Kasdorf. Welcome to this Access Innovations webinar on semantics called Meaning Matters. This one is called What's in a Name? How Kew Helps Drug Regulators. Disambiguate the messy welter of medicinal plant names to shore up regulation and save lives. Before we get going, a few housekeeping items. You'll see a question function in the controls for the webinar. Please put questions for the speakers there. And when we're finished with the presentations, we'll take as many questions as we can. And we will get back to everybody who put in a question by email if we don't get time to answer your question live on the webinar. We will also be recording this webinar. In fact, we are recording the webinar at this point. And we'll be posting probably tomorrow the recording of the webinar plus a PDF of the consolidated slides of the speakers. So you'll be freely available to download that PDF and share it with other folks if you want to do that. And so at this point, I'd like to introduce Bob Allkin. Hello. There we go. Bob's role is managing Kew's medicinal plant name services, which is a key reference for global health regulators, natural product researchers, trade and practitioners, and provides a controlled vocabulary for ISO standard identification of medicinal products. Currently, they seek to expand these services to address the needs of those working with food supplements, allergens, and poisonous plants. He works in the Department of Biodiversity Informatics and Spatial Analysis at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where they're applying computational techniques to analyze, edit, curate, organize, mine, and disseminate data, and to evaluate trends and patterns through time and space. Bob holds a Bachelor of Science with honors in biology from Queen Mary College, London University, and a PhD in computer-assisted plant identification from Westminster University and the Natural History Museum in London. And if that sounds dismayingly technical, you're in for a treat. Bob is not technical. He's actually a very entertaining speaker. So, and this is really a fascinating topic. When I visited Kew, I was just blown away by the fact that the vast majority of their employees, you picture that their employees are all gardeners, they're scientists. It's a magical place. So Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining this afternoon. That was some introduction, Bill. I'll have to be on my toes to live up to that, I think. First of all, I wish to thank Bill and Heather and Margie, of course, for this opportunity to share my work with you. It's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to hear your questions and thoughts. It's really appropriate also for Bill to be introducing me, since it was now some years ago that I had various ideas about how the resources I manage might be relevant and useful in the publishing industry, but was very unclear about how best to approach it. And serendipitously, I met Bill. He was at Kew for some other purpose. I don't even remember what now, but I was able to ask some of my inappropriate questions and expose my naivety about how your industry works. And slowly, over the following months, patiently, Bill explained some of the mechanisms and drivers at play in your world. And critically introduced me to people that he thought would be interested in what we do, but also could help me judge how better to engage. And that led to long discussions with Margie at Access Innovations, which has led to the current very enjoyable and fruitful collaboration that we have today, and that Margie will be describing once I finished. So I'm going to be talking about herbal remedies and public health, really, and the plants behind those. A little bit of context for you. I work, as Bill said, at Kew Gardens. The British public know it very well as a garden that you can go to look for very pretty flowers and wander in woodland, or indeed look at tropical plants in a number of different greenhouses. But behind the scenes, as he also suggested, there is a lot of research going on. So we have curatorial activity with collections of great importance to botanical research globally. I have colleagues that are undertaking research in physiology or chemistry around how plants and fungi are used, or how they relate one to another, or their conservation. And we disseminate this knowledge to scientists, but also for other purposes, some practical and some educational. So there are more than 300 different scientists working at Kew from all sorts of disciplines: physicists, chemists, studying the molecular biology or the ecology. And we look at, primarily, despite the fact that these people come from different disciplines, they would be looking at the relationships between plants in related genera, the relationships between genera, or their conservation. And the collections, we have many collections, but just to give you a flavor for this, our herbarium is one of the largest and certainly one of the better curated herbariums in the world. Because we've been going a long time, it has important historical material, and this includes material in alcohol, but also, as you can see in the upper image there, plants pressed between paper and stored in cupboards. The mycology collection is, I believe, the largest in the world. And then we have the seed collection, we have a DNA bank, we have a chemical profiling bank, so with samples, wood samples and so forth. But one of the most fascinating and enjoyable is the economic botany collection, where you get artifacts created by humans for the use of humans. So this basket is an example, but it includes poisoned arrows from the Amazon, medicines, construction materials, and so forth. And my colleagues do research in all sorts of different ways. They may be looking at the plants in a particular country or particular place. They may be looking at only one genus globally. The conservation efforts look at the conservation areas in tropical countries to help governments do their planning. Deforestation is mapped using traditional GIS methods, but increasingly with drone type technologies to map actually what's going on in the ground. We might be working in a particular country with a particular species, such as coffee. There's an image there of colleagues advising the Ethiopian government about where to grow coffee in the future, anticipating climate change. And then there's a laboratory analysis, the anatomists, the pollens people, the chemists, and the molecular biologists. And the molecular biologists are involved in a really quite exciting new project called the Plant and Fungal Tree of Life, where they're looking to map the genome of all genera of plants and all genera of fungi, and create a genealogy of how these organisms relate one to another in evolutionary time. And they're doing that using a new technique with barcode of the material, with using 350 genes of those plants. And just to give you some perspective, the barcodes of plants that you would have read about in the New York Times or wherever and have been in use for some years would typically include 2 or 3 genes. So this is a real step up in the precision with which we can assign plants. And then we look to disseminate this information, and there's a host of different websites and databases in play. The more recent and flagship, I guess, is this Plants of the World Online portal, which brings together the digital resources that Kew hold around plants, and indeed includes information from some of our collaborating partners around the world. And it looks eventually to be a sort of an encyclopedia plant with all the information that we have, with images and maps and so forth for each of those plants. The other bit of context I need to give you is just around herbal medicines and natural products. And you're probably aware that increasingly these products are of use in the West. The United States particularly is a huge market which has been growing very, very fast and continues to grow. And this generates, trade generates a great deal of pressure actually on the wild populations of some species. Increasingly, some of those species become rarer and rarer, and then as a consequence, they be substituted by cheaper or more easily obtained material which may not have the same efficacy or may have safety concerns for public health. The regulatory procedures, the framework in place for these products is not as strict as it is for pharmaceutical drugs. Nevertheless, in many countries, particularly in Asia, China, India, Indonesia, there are long traditions of using herbal remedies as part of healthcare. And these products may involve many different plants or minerals and plants mixed together. And whilst the scientific evidence is still difficult to obtain, they're very, very complex mixtures. Nevertheless, there is a long tradition of their use, and they would appear to have some use. And I think then 80% of the world's population in rural parts have no choice about using fancy natural products from a herbal shop. They cannot afford an aspirin. They cannot afford the bus ride to go and get to the pharmacy to buy the aspirin. And so they will be using plant herbals as part of their primary health care. And so we as scientists have a responsibility for making sure they're doing that as safely as possible. And finally, of course, plants remain a primary source of pharmaceutical growth. So in the last couple of years, 122 new drugs have been brought to the market based upon molecules which were initially identified or separated from a plant or a fungus. A word of warning, this is from the UK's National Health Service, just pointing out really that although these appear to be natural and that may sell well, that doesn't necessarily mean to say these products are safe. And they are mixtures of all sorts of different chemicals which will be impacting on different parts of different systems within your body, and inappropriate use of these products can be potentially harmful. A bit of terminology also just to kick off. So identifying what plant is found in the field or what is actually in front of me at the time is this identification. And then of course there was the issue of what we call it, and that's where the focus of my talk is today. But then of course there's the authentication, scientifically proving that this material in a packet that's dried leaves or a powder is actually derived from the species that it claims to be. So common names. So much of this will be familiar to you in your own different domains, but nevertheless, I think it's worthwhile just spinning through this. So this is the yarrow plant. I know it's yarrow. I have it on a very good authority that it is yarrow, and that's my grandmother. She knew these plants very well, and I'm confident that she's right. However, had my grandmother been French or German, she would have given me a different name for it. And the Chinese and the Arabs, of course, have their own names for these plants. And then scholars believe it's useful for them to convert these Chinese names into a pinyin equivalent into Latin script so that we can read them. And indeed, had my gran been born in a different part of England even, then she would have given me a different name for this plant. And so we've got one single plant, but a shed loads of different names we called synonyms, and you will be aware the problem therefore is if I want to know everything out about this plant, I have to know that it is called Herba militaris and old man's pepper. This is bluebell, and I'm even more sure that this is the bluebell because not only did my gran tell me, but Kew put up posters every year on the underground in London attracting the public to come and see the bluebell spread underneath the trees in the woodland in the gardens. However, my boss at Kew is a Scot, and this is what he would call a bluebell. And if I went to California, Australia, South Africa, I will find other plants called bluebell, which are really quite different. So this is the reverse case. We've got a single name, but lots of different plants. And we, in our work, refer to those as homonyms. And the ambiguity that this writes, of course, is problematic. If I tell you that bluebell is a very effective diuretic, I would not want you to be using any one of those other species that is not the same as I've been using, because it could have serious consequences. So when I talk about a herbal drug, it will involve a plant, and the part of the plant, it will generally also describe actually what has been done to that part of the plant to make it useful. And in some cases, then there'll be the preparation involved in actually the patient employing that drug for their purpose. And we capture the plants, the parts, and the trade forms in our work. So ginseng is a product which many of you will be familiar with. It's sold in Chinese markets. Panax ginseng is the scientific name of this, and the herbalists in China will be absolutely confident that everything on that image are actually created from the species Panax ginseng. And indeed, there is legislation or pharmacopoeia referring to drugs using Panax ginseng, which are very common. However, if you go into the health food store near you, you will find a whole plethora of different products which have got ginseng written on the box. Some of them have got adjectives such as Korean ginseng, but is that the same thing or is it different? Some of them will suggest that it is ginseng without actually saying what the plant is at all. And our work has exposed that there are products on the market derived from Panax quinquefolius, also from Eleutherococcus senticosus, from Hebanthe erethes, from Withania. Indeed, in the US, there are today products on the shelf called ginseng, which are derived from 16 different species of plant. They, of course, have different unique chemistries and thereby are some potential risks to your health. And these plants actually, of course, they look very like one another when you're looking at dried roots. And there's a nice little story here I'd like to share with you. I think I've got time. A company sold a large batch of Panax ginseng to a manufacturer in Europe. They wanted Kew to authenticate that material and confirm that they had bought a batch of Panax ginseng before they went ahead and used it in their factory. And so the chemists at Kew macerated the material and produced a chemical profile of the sample, and then they compared it with what we would expect from Panax ginseng. And lo and behold, these two chemical profiles appeared very similar. The peaks were in exactly the same place on the chromatogram and all looked good. But fortuitously, at that moment, a dear colleague of mine who is an anatomist and knows TCM products very well walked through the lab, and she saw the root material that was being prepared, and she knew immediately that this was not Panax ginseng, it was another species. And it transpired what had happened was that the company selling this material had very cheekily taken a very, very cheap root that looked vaguely like it and then dipped it into a very dilute solution of the key chemical that is used to test whether or not Panax ginseng is actually Panax ginseng or not. And so this shows you the sorts of problems that occur in quality control in this market. The pharmacists invent names in Latin. Systemafuga rhizoma is this example. It's used in the Chinese pharmacopoeia to refer to drugs from 3 different plants. That raises questions in my own mind, but we'll move on. The same term is used in the Japanese pharmacopoeia to refer to drugs derived from those 4 plants. And then the United States pharmacopoeia or the European pharmacopoeia use exactly the same term, but they mean a different drug, something derived from a different plant. So again, we've got really quite different chemicals and potential uses from 5 species with one term, which is ambiguous. Fangji is one of those pinyin names I mentioned at the top of the talk. It's used in the Chinese pharmacopoeia, the English version, to refer to 2 different herbal drugs based on different species, different purposes, used in very different concentrations. Tragically, in 2008, a Belgian clinic substituted one of these products for the other, and 105 people ended up with renal failure and on dialysis for the remainder of their lives. And this incidence is just one. It was actually turned out that this was commonly occurring in many different countries as people were confused about what exactly Fangji was. And if you take just one of those drugs, you will see that it is referred to in very different ways in standard medical references. And I would just point out at this point that not one of the names on that slide is a scientific plant name. The fact that they're written in Latin is not the point. So scientific plant names, you will probably have heard of this guy, Carl Linnaeus, a Swede that invented the system of binomial nomenclature for plants, animals, insects. And these names are written in Latin, yes. They consist of a genus and a species, and then the author of the publishing who publishes that name. But if that were the only definition, then Hocus Pocus Bob would also be a scientific plant name, and I can assure you it isn't. So there is a code of nomenclature. It's hundreds of pages long, really quite legalistic and detailed, and is reviewed on a 6-yearly basis by experts. But in essence, what it establishes is how the author of a new plant name must behave, and they need to describe how a plant is different from everything gone before. They must cite the specimens. Critically, they have to cite the specimens they are looking at, and we call these type specimens. And then they will need to formally publish it, and that is established within the code. So it is not a scientific plant name. And this specimen from Kew's herbarium was collected by an old erstwhile colleague of mine, Roger Polhill, and an African collaborator. And they named this Polhill and Paulo 629, and that uniquely identifies that particular collection. They may have made duplicate collections, in which case they would have been stored in African herbaria or possibly European herbaria, and all of them would have held that same unique identifier, Polhill and Paulo 628. They were uncertain of the identity of that plant when they collected it. They were not specialists in that group. So they put it in a cupboard at Kew, and subsequently a specialist that did know the group came along and found it. And he immediately saw it as being something that was new, unknown to science at that point. And so he established a new name for this plant and published it with a full description about why it was different, and critically would reference this collection, Polhill and Paulo 629, as the type specimen. And this specimen then becomes recognized as the type, and it establishes for all time what the molecular biology, what the chemistry, what the hairs look like, or the description, whether it's got red berries or not. All that information is forever tied to that Latin name as published, citing this specimen. And finally, just to complete the picture, that digital ID, which is all of our type specimens are digitized, will link that specimen to the DNA record, the chemistry, the seed morphology, and so forth. It's a picture from within our herbarium. As I say, we have some very important historical material, but it continues to grow as collaborators around the world provide material. The ones in red folders there in the cupboards are the type specimens, which I've been referring to, which are particularly important. So we use these names because they're unique, they're global, and the meaning is fixed. It will not change. That string of Latin characters means that specimen, and it will remain so for all of time. And for that reason, these scientific names are used in legislation and regulation, and they differ from pharmaceutical names or common names. So Kew is fortuitous in holding and being responsible for a number of key resources, and the International Plant Names Index is the default catalogue of scientific plant names. There's 1.6 million of them to date. They are given persistent identifiers to enable databases to link with one another. It's being currently edited, and increasingly new plant names, as they are published in journals, are submitted electronically to IPNI. But that lists names. The World Checklist lists plants. What it does is to put all those names into synonymy and establish how many plants there are. Currently, we're thinking there are around 340,000. So you can see there are many, many fewer plants than there are names. It will give you the geography. It is equally being edited all the time, and any family account will go out to peer review. And then finally, we publish as much information as we can on the website using all of those different synonyms to pull together the data and the images that we hold about each plant. So that's pretty good, right? We're in good shape. We can do things for you. Well, there are problems. The first, as I already said, is that there's 1.6 million names for 350k or 340,000 plants. So that on average, it's 4 names for every plant, but medicinal plants have been really well studied because they're so useful. And the result is that for medicinal plants, the ratio is about 16 different scientific synonyms for every plant. And that causes problems. So the FDA here in the US is a long-standing collaborator of ours, and they had been legislating plants using over 2,000 scientific names. And we took that list and validated it for them, and then ultimately returned it to them corrected and with full synonymy. And we found that 60% of their names were good scientific names and were up to date. And that's very, very high percentage. None of their other peers that we have done similar exercises with come anywhere close. They are aware of the problems and really have done a good job. A further 20% of the scientific names they were looking at were good, but they were older synonyms. And that in itself is not a crime. It really doesn't matter, does it, which name we use, as long as we know which plant we're talking about. The issue in this case for FDA was that they were unaware that they were synonyms. And as a result, in that 2,000 scientific names, they were citing 24 plants multiple times under alternative names. And that led to inconsistent regulation of those plants. And finally, inevitably, there are a bunch of names written in Latin that were not actually not suitable for effective regulation. But I stress, FDA do a good job compared with their counterparts. So there are too many names, and then there is a business of ambiguity. Just I mentioned homonyms in the case of bluebells at the outset, but actually this occurs with scientific names, astonishingly as well. So Viburnum fragrans, as published by Bunge, is a name referring to one plant. Viburnum fragrum, as published by Loisel, refers to an alternative plant. They won't both be the accepted name, but nevertheless they can be synonyms of different plants. And so saying Viburnum fragrans is ambiguous. I might mean two different plants. This only occurs in up to 5% of scientific names, but nevertheless, that's a hell of a lot of scientific names, which can be ambiguous if you don't actually add the author. And again, there are consequences. So this was a case that Bill cited in the publicity for this talk. The EU wanted to ban the import of a Japanese poisonous plant, and in doing so, effectively banned star anise. How does this occur? Well, this is the Japanese toxic plant that they wanted to ban. Indeed, it is called Illicium anisatum. This is star anise. But if you look carefully, you can see that Illicium anisatum is also a name for star anise. And so there is ambiguity about their legislation. Indeed, we found further homonyms relating to other species. And so they effectively banned the import of 4 different species into Europe rather than just the one. So there was all chaos was let loose in the industry, and until EU retracted their legislation and reworked it. And then finally, the taxonomy is improving. Our understanding of relationships is improving. And so the taxonomists keep changing names, and the gardeners amongst you will be only acutely aware of this and probably fed up with them. I don't have time today to go into the very good reasons why they do that, but nevertheless, to give you a flavor, 2,000 new plants are being found every year, so that's new names. 4,000 plants are moved from one genus to another on the basis of the chemistry, or increasingly on the basis of the molecular data that we find that the species currently in genus A is not as closely related to the other species in that genus as it is to the species in genus B, and therefore it moves across. The move across instigates, of course, a change in name because of the nature of the binomial system. And finally, species may be split or merged together, again, on the basis of increasing of the volumes of molecular data. And the final obstacle is the way that botanists handle this data, and they want to help, and they put these websites out there with plant name data. And some of these websites have different different purposes. They cover one country or the whole world. They cover different families. They copy data from one from another, which is not then updated. And so you get contradictory results. And who on earth do you as a punter or a health regulator actually believe? And so that's a problem which we really do look to address in our work. And this problem goes beyond, of course, just health regulation, but even scientists. So this is an article in which I was a co-author. We looked at articles published in 2 journals over a 2-year period, and 38% of the scientific names cited in the publications were not precise or unambiguous. And that's in journals where the editors are very well aware that scientific names are needed and will have some control over what's going on in their publications. A colleague of mine, Mark Nesbitt at Kew, a few years earlier, had looked at the literature in nutrition, and there it's an astonishing 93% of the names in the journals that they looked at were not precise enough to be absolutely certain which plant they were talking about in any journal. Of course, that in any article, that of course just devalues that research and its utility. So that's what we try and do. We are trying to solve these problems and serve different communities. We take the information from Kew's core resources. We don't want to duplicate all that work, and we add to it medicinal data. So the drug and the common names, who's regulating these plants, misspelled versions of the scientific names as they appear in the legislation seem to us to be important to help people find it regardless, plant parts, trade forms. And then we deliver this information through different services to a wide range of audiences. And one of the audiences we wanted to reach and have not yet really achieved it has been publishing. So version 9 of our resource was published in January this year, 28,000 species of plant, drawn from 170 health medical references, with close on 500,000 alternative terms involving the plant parts and trade forms. So how would you use it? Well, muxiang is a commonly, widely used traditional Chinese herb. If you go into one of those Chinese herbal shops close to where you live, they will have muxiang as one of their products. And the question really is also what species is being used? What is it really? What should it be called? And if you look in the flora of China, it will give you one name. The Chinese Pharmacopoeia gives a second. US Herbs of Commerce uses a third. The Japanese Pharmacopoeia uses a fourth, and we are aware of further synonyms. So the issue is, where do we get the information that's been published about this plant? How can we achieve that given this plethora of different names? So our website enables you to press a button and go to PubMed and search for Aucklandia costus, which is the currently preferred name for this plant, and retrieve 367 publications. Alternatively, alongside that, we offer you a button which says go and hit PubMed, searching all of the different synonyms that we're aware of. And if you do that, then you retrieve 768 publications. So that's a more than 100% increase on the number of articles that refer to this plant. But you will only find them all if you use all of the synonyms. In the case of a medicinal plant, our evidence is that searching PubMed with one scientific name will retrieve only 15% of the articles that PubMed holds about that plant. That's 15%. So we are, in addition to the portal, we look to validate people's data sets, as I described for us doing for FDA earlier. We've done it for a number of health regulators, WHO, and for scientific databases looking at medicinal plants in India, Sri Lanka, and so forth. European regulators can able to share information one with another by achieving some harmonization. We provide data sets or terminological controls, and we provide web services which refresh those data sets as the names change. And ultimately, we look to advise people on how they build their databases to handle plant names effectively and the sorts of standards that they should be adopting, and promote best practice and provide resources, obviously. So one of our success stories is, again, as Bill foretold in his introduction, is our engagement with the drug regulatory framework, an ISO standard called Identification of Medicinal Products. It covers aspirin, nasal sprays, everything, including herbal plants. And the FDA is a primary driver for this, working with the European Medicines Agency and WHO. They've been pushing for this, and we worked with them to provide the data, the controlled vocabularies of the plant names, the herbal drug names, and the plant parts. And this is now becoming the standard and increasingly adopted by many other drug regulators, indeed professionals in other disciplines around the world. We've published best practice guidelines about how to avoid some of the slip-ups and what you should do, and some of these have been adopted by journal editors in their instructions to authors as to how to prepare plants. But there's a lot to be done, and this was a paper published this year in Nature, of all places, as an editorial, Christina Patmore, who works with me and is probably listening in to this, so I better watch my step, analysed the names that are actually used in this article. And we found that, she found that there are 8 Latin binomials, such as Artemisia annua, but none of these were complete. They all lacked an author, which, as I've explained to you, leads them to be potentially ambiguous. There were 4 common names, such as dandelion, and this is an astonishing level of imprecision. The number of plants that are called dandelion around the world is just immense, and which one of those they are actually suggesting might have some value is really in the lap of the gods. They used these herbal formula written in Latin, but as I've described before, involve complex mixtures. The identity of the plants is not necessarily sure, and in any event, are used inconsistently by pharmacists. And then quinine, they refer to, is certainly the name of a chemical, but it is also the common name of a number of different species. And it's a minor point, but nevertheless, I believe that people are just not aware of the dangers of imprecise use of this terminology. So where do we want to go now? We want to expand the scope. We want to improve the digital access. We want to widen our audience. Including for publishing. And we envisaged all those years ago, before talking with Bill, I imagined that we could provide comprehensive retrieval by providing synonyms, disambiguation of where an article cites ginseng, we can point to the alternative interpretations, and we can help enrich content with links to maps, images, or whatever, but also to help validate new manuscripts before they are published to ensure that those scientific names used are meaningful. So with that, I'm going to draw a close and hand over to Margie.
Thank you, Bob. Very excellent introduction. What I wanted to cover today has to do with the treasure trove that we found in the MPNS data, and then of course we take a bit of a different look at it at Access Innovations in trying to figure out ways to automatically discover, disambiguate, and find this material so that it can be leveraged for lookup and in search. So what we're doing is supplemental in trying to achieve Bob's last objective. When we looked at the data set, it had about just over 28,000 species listed, and they had an average of 14.7 synonyms, which is now up to an even higher number in the new edition. And those are harvested from a significant number of reference files within and outside of Kew. But it came up with, from a taxonomic and disambiguation point of view, over 415,000 unique names. And each of those is represented by full information records with references in the MPNS. We drew from 3 different files of plant information, including unique plant names and IDs, the 258,000 synonyms, and about 160,000 common names. And so what I know from my garden is not necessarily what somebody would call it in a different nation. With all those synonyms, which could be called alt names or non-preferred terms, we wanted to come up with some kind of a thing that would manage those terms and use the Access Innovations artificial intelligence for term disambiguation, identification, and extraction, so that where people could use the full preferred name, we could have the term use and solve misidentification. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first option is to tag all the articles with the preferred name. And this is what somebody would do with their information corpus. And we would use the world's most authoritative database to make that happen, that being the MPNS. There are some competitive products, as you read from Bob's slides, but this one has, I think, more of a solid staff for authentication behind it. And plus, it's backed up by the herbarium and other collections to prove it. So what we've built is something called the Kew MPNS auto tagging service, where people can tag their retrospective collection, that is their back file, and identify names, as Bob pointed out, where there's room for misinterpretation or misidentification or ambiguity in what's there. And they can also systematically look at forthcoming publications as they're submitted and go back to the authors and say, you got to come up with the definitive name for this plant or this compound in order for us to accept it for publication. We also wanted to add a synonymy capability to search, so that makes sure that all the alternative names are searchable. And in doing that, we can ensure the search system points to the authoritative preferred name. And then, as Bob pointed out from his example in Medline, all the tag documents can be found and presented, whatever platform the information collection is loaded on. The way this would work is you take the source data, and that's all the incoming articles or data of any kind, and run it through or against the MPNS source data to get to the automatic indexing system, which is composed of both the source master, which manages the names, and then the automatic indexing system. That then becomes an enriched repository, which can be fed to one or many search systems. And in doing that, you have the preferred form of the term mapped. You can browse by subject. You can use auto-completion. You can use all that synonymy that is available, as well as broader and narrower and related terms, which I'll show you in just a moment. Broader terms in this case would be genus, species, family, order, and so forth. So what else you can do is link to the internal reference service from the MPNS database, which provides the full explanation, the full record, and can be linked to the prime references. So it provides a fully vetted information system on all medicinal plants throughout an information corpus, whether it's a publisher, a pharmaceutical firm, a regulatory agency, or whatever. What we found in the data was that 10%, or about 2,500 names, had no synonyms. And so those were fairly easy to get to, but they were the minority. 90% of the data have extensive synonyms, and we needed to build rules for all of them for synonymy and proximity, and then also where there was a lot of homonyms, we needed to build in some more complexity. So let's look at the details of how this works. If you go to the plant names services database, you can put in a plant name, and here we have ginseng, and you can see from the list below that ginseng is used in an incredible number of ways. Behind that are individual records that have to do with the plant name records, as well as the non-scientific names. And so that's a lot of information. You can see across the top of the screen here that it talks about the scientific synonyms and where it's cited and so forth, as well as giving you the capability to search externally. If we wanted to filter those results a little more, we could look at the accepted names as well as all the other names. And so the resource behind this is pretty significant. What we've done is taken it, loaded into the Data Harmony Maestro product, and sorted first by family name, and then within that by genus and then species. What's different from the way you might have been taught in a high school or college biology class is that the nomenclature does not just include the genus and species name, but also the author name. And without that author name, the person who did the definitive work, we don't know that that's the same plant. So the idea of the way that the word is used is expanded. There are also, in some cases, the varietals, which we need to look at. And then within any particular name, we want to list all of the synonyms, and sometimes they're all the way out to the author name, sometimes they're a comma name. We're looking for the preferred name, the preferred form, but we also have a lot of additional information loaded into the database so that plant ID and other things can be loaded easily into different systems. Well, you can't search all the names all the time. It's really difficult for any researcher to find all the pertinent literature. And it's even worse when you're trying to look for the well-documented uses and variety within any given databases. And as Bob described, the negative consequences for misidentification can be catastrophic, resulting even in death. And it also means that illegal trade, here's a box of stuff and we're calling it this and it's not, cheats both the consumers at one end and the people in developing nations who are raising those plants for sale. So it's also true that the genus species name with the author added is not native to most authors. They use what was handed to them as a named sample and they don't go beyond that, not even necessarily even realizing that others will use a different name. So we need to get everybody to the same name. We need to send everybody so that they use a main preferred term, which is the preferred authoritative name, and then all the synonyms behind it so that we can surface all relative articles. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be serving the researcher, the searcher very well. So this takes on the aspect of being semantic enrichment. It's another kind of metadata that people add to their article records and to their research portfolios. And it also supports, of course, search, but it gives people tremendous time savings in giving them more accurate, at the same time as more in-depth research, and it allows the formation of a platform for much improved science. If we have better communication between the researchers worldwide because they all know they're talking about exactly the same plant, then that's a significant benefit. And we want to be able to reference a widely available authoritative source. It's free, it's out there, it's easy for people to find. And doing that, we're enhancing scholarly and learned publishing and research worldwide. So if you want to try it, let us know. If you want to test your content, you can learn if the science outlined in the paper is valid. You can provide supplemental information to readers. You can leverage the knowledge and terminology that is authenticated by the MPNS. And it's pretty straightforward. It's done by an application protocol interface. It's an API, it's a quick link, and it uses both the MPNS and data harmony. So you can provide the preferred name, which is the official name, the full record. You get the right name every time you have a valid, trusted resource, and it's an enhanced value to authors. You don't run into that mess like what Christina saw in the Elsevier article. And it enables information sharing because everybody's talking about the same thing. We have done some similar things. We've got one for defective cell lines, for suspect science, for detecting programmatically made articles, the Human Genome Project, which is actually 19 synonyms on the average, and poor science, or pseudoscience, detecting things that at least need a second look before they're published. So to make your data as good as it can be, we would love to have you try out this MPNS offering in conjunction with us. So back to you, Bob.
Thanks, Margie. I understand, Bill, that now is the time for questions. Is that correct? Hello?
Hello, this is Heather.
There I am. Yeah, I was muted and I couldn't unmute. I had to get Heather to do that. Yes, this is the time for questions. We have a few minutes left. As I mentioned, if we don't get to your question, we will follow up later. And I think if you're willing, we're willing to run a bit long to deal with more questions. And I should point out specifically, I mentioned that the recording and the consolidated slides will be available after the session, but this particular slide is available as a handout. So if you look in your controls there's a handouts panel, and you'll be able to click on that and download this thing, because obviously you're not going to be able to scribble all this down. So Bob, go ahead and take it away. Well, actually, Heather is our question master. So Heather, could you first of all, have we got questions? And if so, let's get going on the questions.
We do not have any questions yet.
Oh,
I think maybe our presenters were very thorough.
They're all discombobulated.
I guess that's so. So Bob, I can ask you some questions because I've seen all this in action. I'll give people my favorite Kew anecdote. One of the first times I visited Kew, I was getting a tour through the herbarium, and you saw Bob's slide. Maybe while I'm talking, you can get back to that slide, Bob. It's just this fabulous place with just stacks and stacks and stacks of those specimen records, the type records. So the person giving me the tours just pulled out one of the boxes and opened up the box. Here we go. Where is it?
Ah, sorry.
Well, we don't actually have to have the visual.
There it is.
Yeah. So pulled out one of those folders and opened it up, and just as ostensibly this random example of a plant specimen. And I looked down in the corner where the collector, the person who collected the sample, and said, Livingston. And I said, oh, is that the Livingston? Yes, that's the Livingston. That's who collected that sample. I mean, that just gives you a sense of how long Kew has been at this and how incredibly comprehensive this is. So one thing that fascinates me is that this is just a supreme example of the linkage between physical stuff and intellectual information. You can just imagine the kind of network of semantic information that we're dealing with here. It's just millions and millions of things. At some point, I could imagine that, well, we won't get into this, but another thing Access Innovations could help you with is what's called a knowledge graph. That's a topic for another one of these webinars.
Actually, if I can add two things to that, Bill. One is that this already feeds a knowledge graph if the software on the accepting side is there. We've got it coded to the degree that it feeds very well into RDF and Sparkle. It's in fact one of the exports. So it's already in place for people who want to leverage to that direction. And then I have an anecdote about Kew as well. Some of you know that my undergraduate is in botany. And when I was touring the herbarium, having worked in the herbarium at the University of Wisconsin, I did a paper on the circumboreal distribution of a little bog orchid called Pogonia ophlycosoides. And knowing that, Bob pulled out the type specimen for me, which was as thrilling as can be. There are things in there collected by Darwin and all sorts of folks. It's phenomenal. But it's not just the plant herbarium. There's also a fungarium, which has the type specimens for for penicillin and other things. So it's a tremendous and very diverse and well cultivated resource, and we are thrilled to be able to help leverage it for people directly. They don't have to one by one go through every single name and do a lookup. We can provide that for them automatically.
Yeah.
Heather, have we got any questions? If not, then I might just talk this little anecdote about why the hierarchy is important. Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
So
our first question is, Google allows plant identification by image. Can you comment on the results obtained and their validity through this process?
I've never used the Google process specifically, so my comments are more generic. It is inherently difficult to identify plants through photographs. The experience, I was working in rural Brazil in a development project, and the experience there working with people, be they technically or illiterate, their use of images, it is very often the case that a photograph will just show a particular case of a plant and not make available, visible to you, the very key pieces of information which you need to be sure that it is that species or not. So many grasses, just to give one example, look entirely similar if you take a photograph of them. To actually differentiate between one species and another, you need to be able to pulling that grass apart and looking at particular structures which are microscopic in nature. So the photograph won't work. Tree shapes are often helpful in identification, but again, they can be misleading because the way that trees grow will depend on the substrate, whether or not it's very windy or not, and so forth. And so, whilst there is doing that sort of image analysis work is something which I have been involved with as a professional over many decades, and helping students to take leaves of oak trees growing in parts of the UK, for example, and then doing a classificatory analysis on just the leaf shape. And you can detect that there are 3 or 4 species and maybe a hybrid through multivariate statistical analysis. And then you can present a single leaf, and it will point you to one of those species, effectively identify that leaf as belonging to one of those previously classified plants. But doing that for 340,000 plants is just not where the science isn't there yet. The information, the knowledge base is not there yet, I'm afraid. And so a line drawing with which is possibly coloured and with an arrow pointing to the key feature that you need to be looking at to make sure that you can differentiate it between one species and another is often more effective than a photograph. That would be my response.
So,
And we're coming to the top of the hour. Heather, are there other questions now?
I have to say that if you go to Google Plant ID and you look at the comments on it, I would say 2 things. One, it is a very dangerous application. Bob is being kind, but I think it's dangerous, particularly since it says it's going to alert you to toxic plants and diagnose and nurture. Some of the comments say that it's accurate less than 5% of the time. So no, don't use it.
It's probably useful for home gardeners to say, is this a daisy or is this an aster? That level
so is there time interest for me to describe why the hierarchy in the terminology is important, or would you rather move on, Bill? Sorry.
If we have any questions, we should take the questions, but if not, I'd be happy to hear that.
Yeah.
There's just a comment. Thank you, Bob and Margie, for a great talk. Fascinating examples. I do want to point out that under the handouts tab on your control panel is a PDF of Bob's slide for further information, in case anybody wants that. We will also post that on our website when we post the video and the slide decks.
Okay.
So if there is interest for Bob to delve deeper, I think you can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. So
people can hang on if they want, and I'm interested.
At one point in my talk, I said about taxonomists keep changing names and how it upsets gardeners and so forth. This is a case in point, really. So quite some time ago, 20 years ago probably, biochemists at Kew had isolated a particular chemical which inhibited the HIV, the AIDS virus, and it led to a better understanding of how the AIDS virus replicated, and therefore led to some interesting medical research and improvements in the control. And the chemical that they had found was found in an Australian tree called Castanospermum australe, and they named the chemical Castanospermum as a result. But having published that paper and got a lot of publicity and brownie points, the question was, so where might we find chemicals which are very similar to Castanospermum, but are slightly different? And the obvious answer to that question is you would look at species which are closely related. They are, because of the evolutionary pathway that they share, they are much more likely to have that chemical or something that is very like it within them. Sadly, it turned out that there was only one species in the genus Castanospermum. It was the only species in the genus in Australia. And so the chemists were a bit stuck. They didn't know what to do. So they then went and started talking with their more traditional taxonomists colleagues at Kew, who knew this particular group of plants well. And they had already established in their minds and amongst their discussions with their colleagues around the world that the genus Castanospermum was actually the same thing as a South American genus called Alexa. They just happened to have been published at different times. They happened, for historical reasons, they were treated as two genera when they really should have been one single genus. And no one had really had the time or the resources to publish the changes of names to this. And in reality, Alexa has found to have 10 species in it, the South American 10 species from South America, and each of these species had similar molecules to Castanospermum, which then led on to much more interesting research and a better understanding of how AIDS virus replicated itself. And so the consequence of this, I think this just actually shows you why it is important that taxonomists change the name and what they're doing. They're using the hierarchy that I was referring to, the genealogical tree, to anticipate what properties each plant will have.
Fantastic story, Bob. Thank you. Well, we're about 4 minutes over. I think we'll just thank everyone for coming, those who are still here, and stay tuned for another one of these webinars in our series. We're trying to pick a lot of variety. One other comment I was going to make is that, you know, this one is all about plant names, and it's because it very thoroughly illustrates the complexity of the nomenclature and naming issues. But those are issues that occur in basically every field of study. So the kinds of things that Bob and Margie have done here, maybe not to the same scale, but will be useful to lots and lots of journals, research organizations, et cetera, in a really wide variety of fields. So I hope it's been helpful.
Thanks, Bill.
Yep, thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.